Alan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I think, well, I don't know whether officials have to behave like that. If you don't want to handle a problem, you consider that problem in a way as if it does not exist. When you discuss an issue, you treat that issue as non-existent. Well, Mr. Chairman, for Chapter 7 of Report number 62, for the details, under the able leadership of you, Mr. Chairman, and the Audit Commission, I believe the Bureau and the departments will be able to resolve the issues. Can I discuss this now? Well, the social enterprises are now under the portfolio of the Home Affairs Bureau. In Hong Kong, in future, shall we have a large-scale policy on SEs to address emergency social issues, and whether or not SEs will continue to grow to a considerable extent will all depend on the Secretary for Home Affairs. I mentioned Jimmy Oliver, but that has evolved into a discussion on personal adoration. Well, in 2013, on the 21st of April, on the website of the Home Affairs Bureau, there's this article of From Social Enterprises to Finance. The article mentions the United Kingdom. It said that the UK is one of the pioneers in promoting SEs, so there's a new social modus operandi. There are bonds with social benefits, and in the article it is mentioned that in 2012 the UK launched a bond with social benefits, and a certain county and a certain fund have arranged for 380 youngsters who have gone to correctional services institutions, and counseling was provided to them. Well, I believe the SHA remembers that article. In Hong Kong, I said we need a policy on SEs. Precisely, it's for such developments that we should create an environment to pave the way for a policy on social enterprises. Just now, the SHA apparently was unwilling to have a meaningful exchange with me on this issue. Maybe I should ask certain questions for the sake of the record. Now, SHA, if we are to have a policy on SEs so as to contribute to Hong Kong, may I say something on this article published last year? Well, from that article, we apparently can grasp a certain concept adopted by you. If we are to have a consistent policy, then society will have a different environment. May I ask you, under your leadership, this SE Advisory Committee is also assisting you. Do you have a vision to the effect that Hong Kong will have a suitable environment to develop something like what you described in the article on the 21st of April last year, modeling on the example of the UK? Secretary, the SARG and the HAB in terms of promoting SEs would like to formulate a set of policies and strategies for SEs. As I said in the last session, we listened to the expert and professional and scholastic views of the Advisory Committee on SEs, which had come up with some strategic proposals. We'll definitely follow up on that. How should we promote SEs? How should we formulate policies and strategies on them? These are rather complicated issues. The policy aspect is very strong. Well, SEs are also enterprises. They are one form of enterprises in Hong Kong's market. To what extent should they develop? We should really study that issue in detail. Mr. Leong mentioned my article. Well, we do have that vision. Hong Kong is an international financial center. We always compare ourselves with London and New York. Can the financial sector also support SEs? What should our future direction be? I think we need to conduct studies and further promote SEs. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to hear that answer from the Secretary. In his article, in fact, up to April last year when he published that article, 60% of our SEs were actually operated by departments under NGOs and 39% by registered companies and 1% in the form of cooperative societies. Just now, we learned from the SHA his vision formulated on the basis of his article last year. I really want his vision to be realized in Hong Kong as soon as possible. I have a question for the SHA. Now, this dream on SEs, if you want that dream to materialize, as the gatekeeper, as the leader, what would you expect? Would you try to share your vision with the SEs? Well, Mr. Chairman, in the main, we should focus on value for money. In the SE Advisory Committee, at our previous meetings, every time when we discussed the success and development of SEs, we considered that the most important factor is that the crucial factor should be to nurture social entrepreneurs. That's why we spent a great deal of time and injected a great deal of resources on social enterprises together with the tertiary institutions. We launched a number of training programs. We educated young people in terms of business as well as social care. Mr. Chairman, let me boldly say this. If the government, I mean the whole SARG, shares the same dream as Mr. Zhang, the SHA, I'm surprised that there's no legislative or statutory definition for social enterprises. And I'm surprised that there's no system for regulating SEs. Well, if they can do so, SEs will be more value for money. Are we spending a lot of money on SEs? Well, not really. If you calculate the sums of money wasted by the SARG, then just a few $100 million is not really a huge sum. However, in terms of value for money, we would like SEs to be more effective and the effectiveness to be more manifested. And we would like the effectiveness of SEs to be more obvious in society. And I'd like to proceed on that basis. Now, from the response of the SHA just now, am I correct to understand that priority considerations should head towards the direction of defining SEs and to have consistent support for SEs, but the SARG has not accorded a high priority for SEs in those regards. As for value for money, if we want to see more effectiveness, there may be difficulties, or perhaps I shouldn't have high expectations. Am I correct to say this? Should the SHA not try his very best as the gatekeeper to strive within the SARG to, as soon as possible, enhance the priority accorded to SEs, such that the social effectiveness of SEs can be more manifested? Mr. Chairman, we attach importance to the formulation of policies on SEs. But that may not mean that we need to define what social enterprises are. That doesn't mean that we need to legislate on SEs. We did have in-depth discussions on whether or not we need to define the term social enterprise. Well, there are pros and cons. Here, in the initial stage, we try to keep an open mind, and we deem that conducive to the development of SEs. Mr. Allen Leung, any more questions? No. Then Mr. Ng Leung Sing. Mr. Chairman, let me ask a simple question first. That is about paragraph 2.35. As we mentioned, the 3E project is to assist the PWDs to a certain extent. 385 PWD jobs were created, 30% were full-time jobs, 115, and then 270, that is 70%, were part-time jobs. But there are huge discrepancies in monthly salaries, ranging from $1,000 to $8,000. So a huge discrepancy there. For the job arrangements for these few hundred PWDs, I'd like to know whether there are huge discrepancies in terms of their disabilities, such that 70% were not given full-time jobs. Or is it that the PWDs themselves did not want to engage in full-time jobs? And what about the huge discrepancy in monthly salary? Is it that PWDs, though involved in full-time jobs, were not given the same salary as the able-bodied. That is, even though they work 8 hours a day. Can we have some supplementary information in that regard? Mr. Chairman, let me explain. There are 2 questions here. For these PWD employees, why some of them only worked part-time? As I answered Mr. Wong's questions, I said that in employing PWDs, we did have a productivity assessment, which is voluntary. If a PWD considers himself not so able and only wants to engage in part-time jobs or easier jobs, he can choose to undergo an assessment. Whether or not a job is full-time, how many hours worked per day, etc., all count towards the monthly salary. As for working hours and salaries, they may be related to each other, but not always. Well, if a PWD works full-time, but the productivity is not as high as that of an able-bodied, the PWD may receive a lower pay.
Nothing. Perhaps director didn't quite catch my question. Now, I said that as many as 70% of them were working part-time. My question was, did the majority of them work part-time voluntarily, or was it because of productivity assessment? That's mainly the reason. As I said, the majority of PWDs employed were formerly mental patients, and I reluctantly accept this explanation. I think some figures should be given to show whether it's after the productivity assessment that they were forced to work part-time, or that some wanted to work part-time of their own volition. And my next question is this. Secretary just now answered part of my question. That is about the role of the Social Enterprise Advisory Committee. I believe the committee, comprising more than 10 members, has been able to make recommendations, and some of the members were also participating in, for example, tendering exercises. Since this is value for money audit, we need to be more prudent on the use of resources. Now, I'd like to ask about the 2-tier declaration system. I think you have considered very thoroughly and to safeguard the use of public resources. That's why you have this 2-tier declaration system. My guess is whether you have made adequate assessment and whether you have sought help from the ICC to see if there are any loopholes in your system. That's the first question. 3.20a, last sentence. Now, some members might have conflict of interest. And here it says the members must apply to withdraw from the meeting when the application was discussed, or the chairman would decide whether they needed to withdraw from the meeting when the application was discussed. Now, the system seemed quite adequate. However, later on in the paragraph, you can see that there were 5 cases involving possible conflicts of interest. It's not just alleged conflict of interest. It says possible conflicts of interest, and yet no member had withdrawn from the meeting, and the minutes do not reflect the chairman's ruling as to whether they needed to withdraw from the meeting. So my question is whether you have anything in black and white requiring the chairman to exercise certain power or to make a statement if the chairman decides a certain member is not required to withdraw from a meeting. And if this statement is not made, the reason should be set out. You agree with the audit recommendations, I can see from the later paragraphs. So first of all, is this a loophole? Secretary. This audit report mentions 2 advisory committees. One is the SEAC, Social Enterprise Advisory Committee, chaired by me, which offered advice on the promotion of social enterprise from the policy level. The other advisory committee is in relation to the ESR program. That is from the departmental level. It decides how resources are to be utilized. I'll defer to Mrs. Tan, Director. Now, in relation to the ESR program, the advisory committee has been following the administration's guideline. First of all, the members are required to declare their interests, and on individual applications at the vetting stage, if necessary, they need to make declarations and then withdraw from the meetings. In the beginning of 2014, we started a new requirement. That is, if at the start of the meeting a member has made a declaration of interest, and if the chairman has made certain ruling on whether withdrawal is necessary, such would be put on record. Sometimes a chairman may decide that the member is not required to withdraw from the meeting because, according to the member's declaration, the member might once have been a member of a certain of the applicant organization, and that was a long time ago, and the chairman might then decide it was not necessary for the member to withdraw from the meeting. And that's usually the standard or the yardstick adopted by government organizations. And from the information, out of 4 advisory committee meetings, no explicit conflict of interest were declared. The members were being prudent in declaring their affiliation with the applying organization. Now, as for the 5th meeting, the member joined only at the very end of the meeting and at the end of the discussion. So the chairman decided it was not necessary for the member to withdraw from the meeting. Have you consulted the ICAC? In relation to the ESR program, we have not specifically consulted the ICAC, but we do follow the established practice of the government. That is, there is a general guideline applicable to all throughout the government. Now, about the 5 minor conflicts of interest, you explained that there should not be any direct conflict of interest involved, and it might have to do with the member's previous capacity. But the recommendation is that the relevant decisions or the declaration should be recorded and documented in the minutes. That is to say, before that, nothing was written down. that means before that if the chairman agreed that the member needed to withdraw from the meeting, it was not documented in minutes. That's correct. Before 2014, there was no requirement for the Secretariat to have it documented in the minutes. But after 2014, we have implemented this requirement. Mr. Kenneth Lau, 2 questions. One on financial arrangements, the other on the operation of funds. You can now go jump to the later part on financial arrangement. Now, for the ESR program and the other SIE fund, it's very similar, but on financial arrangement, it's very different. I'm talking about the 3E project. According to paragraph 2.2 and 2.3, there are 2 rounds of funding. That is to say, $50 million was first allocated in the first financial year. And then, after 2006, because an increase in the provision was required, the panel on welfare services and the finance committee finally approved a new commitment of $50 million. And later on, there were further commitments ranging from $4 million to $100 million on 2 occasions. And these applications were approved by the FC. And that was the funding arrangement for the 3E project. Because the $150 million, to my understanding, is non-recurrent expenditure. Therefore, approval from the Finance Committee and the Welfare Services Panel was required. For the ESR program, according to 2.33 of the audit's report, the HAB, after consulting the FSTB, decided not to create a non-recurrent commitment in this regard, and therefore approval from FC was not required. And then further on, now my understanding is this: that's in 3.16. Why is it that for the ESR program, the relevant panel was not briefed? My understanding is that when this commitment of $300 million was created, it was put under recurrent expenditure, so it became incorporated in the appropriation bill, and the de facto approval was given by LegCo as a result. That's why the panel was not briefed. So that explains the similar nature of the project but different funding arrangements. So please explain to me why, hadn't you consulted the panel and FC and seek approval for more funding? We consulted the FSTB on the ESR program, and we were instructed not to create a non-recurrent commitment. One of the reasons was that one of the major program areas of Home Affairs Department is social building, and the ESR program is under this program area. Since we have on a regular basis been engaged in community building, our instruction is that ESR program stands part of the community building effort and no non-recurrent commitment is necessary. And the FSTB also explained to us that this is not uncommon, and there had been previous examples, and we had not intended to circumvent the Finance Committee of LegCo. Because the purpose of setting up a ESR program under HAD was to help the socially disadvantaged, and in 2006 we consulted the Subcommittee on Poverty Alleviation of LegCo, and in 2012 we also briefed the panel on Home Affairs of LegCo on the relevant arrangements. In particular, back then the commitment was increased, and we briefed the LegCo panel back then. We had not intended to circumvent the FC. You had not intended to do so, but you did in fact circumvent the FC. We're talking about a commitment of $300 million, so we need to be prudent. My question is, why did FSTB make such recommendation? What had been done? You said that there had been previous cases involving other policy bureaus, but is it the correct way such that you could get the commitment by circumventing FC? Now, since I'm here, let me give you an explanation. Well, both projects seek to help SEs. Why is it that they are different? They have different funding arrangements, but in terms of controlling the use of public money, the FSTB is of the view that both approaches are in compliance with the allocation of public money. Government expenditure is the largest amount of public expenditure. This is the first step. Every year we need to go through LegCo to seek its approval. For the heads and subheads of different government departments, if the changes involved exceed $10 million, we also need to seek approval from FC. So it's a matter of priority. The appropriation bill should come first, and should there be any changes, we would then apply to FC. And that's the second tier. And then we come to talk about the expenditure of different government departments. As set out in the report, there are three different kinds: recurrent expenditure, non-recurrent expenditure, and also capital expenditure, the purchase of vehicles and boats, etc. Let's set that aside. Our discussion is now on whether it should be recurrent or non-recurrent expenditure. The money we're talking about is actually spent on a recurrent basis, but it's time limited. So there are different arguments. Both approaches are acceptable. What is meant by time-limited recurrent expenditure? Now, one example is the electoral and registration offices. There may not be general elections every year, but expenditure, the office also incur annual expenditure. So more resources will be allocated during an election for the purpose of general elections, so that during an election year they can apply for it to stand part of the recurrent expenditure. As for time-limited recurrent expenditure, we take the approach of a we take it as a non-recurrent expenditure if it doesn't happen too often. For example, a major international conference is to be held in Hong Kong, and this is not a regular event, and resources can be given by way of non-recurrent expenditure. That is If the amount exceeds $10 million, you need to go to FC. So that depends on the nature of the program. That is why on this occasion, the FSTB is of the view that ESR program could be done by way of a recurrent commitment. When ESR program was introduced, there were concerns that it should be district-based and the purpose should be to alleviate poverty. And that is why we considered that as recurrent expenditure. It's not an issue of circumventing the Legislative Council. Back then, the relevant panel had noted the ESR program, the paper was submitted and members were briefed, and there should be a clear explanation. If there is a new initiative, a major policy introduced, there should be clear explanation given to electrical members, and from the documentation you can see that such a clear definition explanation was given.
I might understand what is time-limited recurrent expenditure, but I don't know if my understanding is correct. If the department has a recurring expenditure, say $300 million, but I only used $10 million and have $290 million left. Now, if it's in the nature of a recurrent expenditure, then is it that the department has to transfer the balance to the general revenue account before the end of the financial year? Now, this is in the nature of a recurring expenditure. Now, you granted $300 million. The balance is then deposited within the department. Is this appropriate? Now, you may call this a time-limited non-recurrent expenditure, but if the balance is not transferred back to the general revenue account, then I feel it's not appropriate. Do you have an explanation? We will not be concerned whether the department benefits itself with the balance of the money that could not be spent. In the ESR program, the government's commitment is very clear. There's an upper limit, and we have an agreement with the department, and no matter how much the money the department spent, it has all to be spent on the program. Now, it's better to come back to the LegCo from the perspective of better governance. Now, the ESR, for the ESR, we ensure that they give a clear account to LegCo whether it's recurrent or non-recurrent expenditure. Now, is it that there must be a more exhaustive count in the case of a recurrent expenditure than non-recurrent expenditure? Not necessarily. The controlling officer will make the decision. $30 million is not a lot. In community building, now for 1 year, we are talking about $1 billion spent on community building per year. Now, for the ESR, it's $30 million. It's a relatively small amount, but they agreed that in the controlling officer's report, in order to increase the transparency, there would be more lengthy accounting for it. Now, please, Chairman, let me finish my question. I will not extend my question any further. My question has not been answered in that if there is an amount left over, now does that have to be turned over at the end, over at the end of the financial year to the general revenue account? Well, whether it would be returned to general revenue account, it's an internal matter of internal distribution. Now, if you haven't spent the money will not belong to you. You have the approval from LegCo to spend $100, but if you spend if you spend only $80, you would not get the $20. You would not get that money in for your own pocket. Now, as for whether you can get the $20 to spend in next financial year, now you can ask for $120 for the next financial year. You can't just pocket the money and not return it. Kenneth? I have one further question about the operations of the funds. They are more technical. In the audit report, now, there's another problem. Now, in the differentiating between capital and recurring grant, now there are some utility deposits some deposits or rental deposits that they granted the amount in respect of that, but they didn't ask for the deposit to be returned. So there may be double granting. So you allocated the money as a capital grant for stock in trade, and then every year you would also grant the operating grant in respect of that stock. Now, from the audit report, I understand that the amount of operating grant is the turnover less the cost, and then if there's a deficit, you would subvent that deficit. And the amount of subvention depends on how much you granted on that project. But for that stock in trade, should it be a capital grant or operating grant? You haven't made that clear. And so that's a problem. And it appears in both. Now, the government officials do not have the basic commercial knowledge required. So isn't it a bit insufficient? We have made improvements in this regard regarding the deposits. Why is it that some were approved but others not? Now there are two types of situations. One, in the contract it would be specified that the deposit has to be returned afterwards. In other cases, there has been no specification. The return was specified in cases where the amount is large. Say if it's a small amount, in principle it has to be returned, but it's not specified in the contract, so or the agreement. So now we will not now say if someone cannot start a business without the grant for deposit, we would give that, but otherwise we will not provide grant for deposits. So there must be certain clauses in the contract specifying that the deposits would be returned to the government. Now, as for the stock in trade, in 2010 we discussed that, and the assessment committee reviewed the situation, and we felt that this shouldn't come under capital expenditure. So in future, we will not provide grants for that in capital expenditure, and we have amended that in the ESR guide. Now, for the stock in trade, we would not provide the grants in both capital and operating grant. There wouldn't be double granting. The important thing is that for operating grant, operating expenditure, we provide the money in advance for them to for their cash flow purposes. And for capital grant, they pay for that first, and then they ask for reimbursement. Now for stock in trade, in both cases, they can apply in both cases, but there wouldn't be double granting. Well, there may be a chance for mistake, because stock in trade, I'm sure the audit commissioner would agree, stock in trade is part of operations. Now, you mustn't have two possible approaches. There must be only one approach so that there wouldn't be any mistake. We agree with the audit report. We will make an appropriate arrangement. I have a simpler follow-up question. Now, under 1.2 or 1.3, if they make profits, it has to be reinvested in the SE. Now, in a case where they are making money, suppose that the SE has to cease business, and the government has provided grants in the past. Will you ask them to return the profits to the government, or will you let them keep the profits? Because that seems to go against the principle in 1.2 and 1.3. Are there such cases? Do you get the money from them, or you let them keep the profits? Because that's against your original intention. Now, our past approach is that if an SE makes money, we will not ask for the profits to be returned or deducted against the grant. Well, they are no longer engaging in business. They are winding up. Now, I'm not talking about the future. How about the past? Were there such cases? In the past, we did not ask them to return the money. So you let them keep the profits. The SEs have to plow back their profits. Yes, but the business has ceased. Let me supplement. First, in the reality, it's only after the grant period that they cease business. We monitor for 3 years afterwards, and then according to the grant agreement, we can claim the amount that we should get. You can, but do you actually get the money back? Can you give us the data? How many cases are there where business has ceased and you did get the money back? Can you look at the cases where the business has ceased and there have been profits that are returned to you? Can that be in writing? Next, Alan Leong. Now, Chairman, I would like to ask. Now, originally, the 3E project under SWT. It started in 2001. Why is it that in 2006 there is an ESR of the HAD? In addition, now you can take the 3E project and put it in HAD, or you can put the ESR under SWT. So what was the thinking? Chairman, I was not in the government back then, but the consideration, as I understand, was that given the economic situation at the time, the government tried to create employment opportunities. So this was a different consideration from the SWD's 3E project, which tried to help the disabled. So it was put under HAD. Now, we read the audit report. There were other cases later. For instance, the Labor and Welfare Bureau has a CIIR and CIIF, and then the SWT has a program of partnership to help the disadvantaged, and then the Environment Department has a Environment and Conservation Fund, and then of course the ESR. Now, so for people who want to operate SGs, they do not know how to decide, and you also expend administrative efforts to coordinate these 7 or more different schemes. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Zhang, now, do you feel that this situation is not the ideal one? Chairman, now, these funds were introduced for different objectives at different times. They meet different policy needs. For instance, this innovation fund under the COP, the objective is not only in respect of SEs, but it also supports young people who want to start new businesses. So overall, it's to alleviate poverty. Now, for SEs, whether we define SEs or not, the profit sharing would always be subject to constraint. Now, but if we encourage young people to start their businesses, then there wouldn't be such a restraint on what they can do with their profits. I've heard the Secretary, but I still feel that if you have SG policy, then you have a better or more efficient outcome. Now, the Secretary said that the SEAC views are quite diverse on whether there should be a definition for SE, whether there should be a registration system, whether there should be legislation. Whether to attract certain industries, whether to issue certain bonds, and some of these were alluded to in the speech by the Secretary. Now, can the Secretary share with the PAC now what are the arguments for and against that have been aired? Now, I'm not exceeding the scope of my powers now in asking these questions. Now, the government offers funding through these 7 funds. 5 of them are not under the scope of the PAC on this occasion, but I'm quite sure that quite a significant amount of money would be allocated through these 7 schemes. Now, so we at LegCo, we do think that we should try to decide whether this is the best way to spend public money. And I hope the Secretary can tell us about the different views that have been offered at the SEAC, so that we can refer to them when we write the report.
In the Social Enterprise Advisory Committee, we had some discussions on the definition of an SE. As far as I can remember, at the very beginning, we would very much like to have a definition, and we should have a bottom line in terms of social benefits or otherwise. And then part of the profits should be plowed back to the SE concerned for further development. However, after some discussions, we came to the conclusion that to distribute the dividends of an SE might not be a negative approach. And then we have to take into consideration the social objectives of SEs. Just now, members also asked a number of times what we meant by social objectives. It's not easy to have a definition. Sometimes an enterprise may not be an SE. Say if an enterprise is engaged in housing development, it's not an SE. Still, it can claim that it is contributing to society. So at the beginning, we would like to reduce that sort of controversy as far as possible. And in fact, those who are engaged in SEs roughly know their objectives. And what about the information that Mr. Leung asked for? Can you give us some information about past projects? Well, as far as I understand, Mr. Leung would like to understand more our previous discussions on whether or not it is good to have a statutory definition for SEs or otherwise. However, our discussions have been very open. I might not be able to come up with very tidy records. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm not really asking for records. Whenever we ask for records, it becomes a very sensitive issue. Well, the SHA is a very dedicated official in this regard. That's what I gathered from his article in April last year. So if the Secretary is committed to this, we would like to help him such that under the existing framework, the Secretary would be able to fulfill his dreams. That's why when we discuss report number 62 of the audit, for this particular chapter, we would like to know the supporting views, the dissenting views, and so forth. So, it's out of good intention that I'm asking this. Well, of course, it is rather unfortunate that the Secretary did not seem to want to provide us with those information. But if he is willing, I'd like to know what the supportive views were and what the considerations back then were. To prepare for this hearing, I've done some homework. As Mr. Kenneth Leung said, in the UK, they don't just have one piece of legislation. They have the community interest company concept. They also have social value added. And then in Canada, they have community contribution companies. They have this concept. And they have Act on the Promotion of Social Enterprises. From what I can see from those documents, well, of course, you may say that it is not appropriate for us to totally copy their models because our social conditions are different and we're in different stages of social development. Yet, given the difficulties mentioned by the SHA, I'd like to say that other jurisdictions also faced those difficulties. The SHA has not told us why he has reservations over our requests. So it's difficult for me to judge whether or not his remarks were appropriate. Anyway, in other jurisdictions, say Jimmy Oliver's products can be bought in our supermarkets. So I really cannot see why we should always harp on old tunes. We're sorry for using that expression. What I'm saying is that there's no reason for the Secretary to say that it's not possible for us to adopt other models. As the SHA said, well, why we have 7 subvention funds? Well, when they saw a need, they created a fund, and then when they see other needs in future, they may create an 8th fund or a 9th fund. Well, is this really effective in using our resources on SEs? At the moment, 40% of the SEs are operating as registered companies. All right, these enterprises do not ask you for money. Have we created the best environment for these enterprises such that they can fulfill their mission of benefiting society? Now, all these issues I'd like to discuss with the SHA. Legislation, definitions, ancillary tax measures like those in the UK, Canada, and South Korea. Well, all these will benefit social enterprises. I don't see any cons at all. Well, maybe I'm too naive. Well, perhaps the administration has already thought about all these aspects. So I'd like the SHA to share his experience with us from the angle of an expert. Thank you very much for Mr. Leong's comments. May I defer to the Deputy Secretary? Concerning the HAB and the HAD, a lot of discussions have been conducted. May I refer you to paragraph 5.32 to 5.39. In fact, the definition has already been set out in paragraph 1.2, and then in chapter 5, the same was repeated. Profits have to be plowed back to the business of the SE concerned. Community interest company in the UK was the concept that we modeled on. In fact, the HKCSS in compiling its directory also took reference from the UK model. May I refer you to paragraph 5.34. Should we adopt an even more stringent definition? Well, if the government is to formulate a definition, that is, if you satisfy these conditions, if you satisfy these standards, you're an SE. Otherwise, you cannot use the label of SE. The HAB did say that it had absorbed the advice of the SE Advisory Committee that a unilaterally set strict definition may not be conducive to SEs. Now, it said here this was particularly important given the diversity of SEs in respect of their trades, business scales, development stages, and operation modes. In the past 2 odd hours, we discussed the same. Therefore, the administration will encourage and support sector-led initiatives to enhance public understanding of SEs. May I refer you to paragraph 5.39, the response from the administration. The HAB says there that with no intention to set a strict definition for SEs. We do have a definition, but even though you do not satisfy our definition, you may still be regarded as an SE. Otherwise, we may be eliminating developing SEs. Indeed, we admit that there is a need to keep in view the case for adopting a more refined definition of SE, and the HAB will continue to consult the stakeholders in order to map out the next step. And then in paragraph 5.10, as repeated by the SHA and myself, that the Bureau and the SEAC had already commissioned the Chinese University and the HKCSS to carry out a study on the latest development of SEs in order to assist us in formulating our strategies. Given our present position, we'll take on board the advice of the SEAC in formulating the future of SEs. Well, whether or not we need to give a definition to SE will also be covered in that study report. But then the study report has not yet been completed. We'll have to respect that academic report. I can say for sure that this issue should continue to be discussed. Mr. Alan Leong, do you have any idea as to when we'll be able to see the report? Do you have a time frame? Well, we've entered the final stage of our work. We'll give a final opportunity for advisory committee members to add their views. Then the consultants will have completed their work and will report back to the relevant panel of the LegCo, such that the panel can carry out a more in-depth study on the basis of that study report. Do you have a timetable? Well, please give us the report as soon as possible. Who's your counterpart? The Social Welfare Department or the Home Affairs Bureau? Well, it's the SEAC. Oh, so you did not mean the LegCo's panel. Well, after the report is completed, to which panel will you go? That means your counterpart in LegCo. Welfare Services Panel, I believe. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this. After all, you need to consider whether or not you should just go to the Welfare Services Panel. In Hong Kong, we cannot have Jimmy Oliver because the concept adopted by the SARG is rather old-fashioned. It considers this social welfare instead of a component of our economy. You do not consider SEs in terms of GDP. That will restrict the development of SEs. Well, it doesn't matter. Let us adopt a gradual approach. This 4-hour public hearing will provide more food for thought for Mr. Zhang Taxing, the SHA. I don't think Mr. Zhang is telling us that there's no room for maneuvering. Well, I know time's up for me. Should I queue up again? Well, we still have a few more questions to go. For 2.9, 2.10, and 3.32, 3.23, and so forth. When you apply for funding for the 3E project and the SRE or ERS program, is it that your framework is too bureaucratic such that the SEs have not been able to serve the community in the best manner? Mr. Chairman will of course agree that we should proceed as quickly as possible with everything such that SEs can grasp the business opportunities. I have to say that many SEs that come to apply for funding are applying for the first time, so they also need some time to furnish us with sufficient information such that we can handle the application. And then after handling the application, if we decide to grant them the funding, they need to do a lot of procedures. For example, to apply for a license. So the 100-odd days cover information submission as well as all those procedures, including licensing. Maybe we can do a number of things concurrently rather than proceeding from one step to another. We'll review the whole process and see whether or not we can compress the whole process. Mr. Alan Leong, one of my questions has already been answered. I'd like to tidy up some minor points. In the audit report for 2.38, paragraph 2.38, some calculations have been done for you. Well, the cost ranges from $12,500 to over $360,000 for the 3 project. And then in 3.34, it said that the cost per unit ranges from $9,000 to $360,000 for the CIIF, or rather for the ESR program. So why do we have such wide ranges. To create a post with $9,000 to $360,000, is it really value for money? Director, when we counted the number of posts, we counted the posts created by the SEs themselves. But sometimes, apart from self-created posts, there can be indirect posts created. Maybe households or individuals are commissioned to produce artwork for sale, for consignment sale by the SEs. And these are indirect posts or jobs. And sometimes an SE may commission another establishment to produce products for consignment sale by the SE concerned. Now, these posts are not calculated. So, prima facie, the cost for creating every job is very expensive. But in actual fact, it's not that expensive. In future, perhaps we should include the indirect jobs created, then we'll calculate the cost per job created. Director?
To supplement on the issue of cost, under the 3E project, for the cost per job, according to our calculation, it was quite high. But we also need to look at the individual projects. Some, for example, in one project, the SE operated a kiosk, and we approved $1.84 million. For fixed assets, however, $1.4 million went to the fixed assets because the SE needed to purchase some equipment and also to renovate the premises. So for the capital grant that depended on the business involved, for the ESR program, in the future, we will provide information for members' reference as for the cost per project. Now, only the PW jobs were considered or incorporated in the calculation of the cost of ESR program. And however, there were also able-bodied staff members that were not included in cost calculation. So this is for members' information. Some minor matters, Chairman. Let's also deal with them. Publicity, right? 4.25. The Director of Home Affairs agrees with the audit's recommendation. One of the recommendations is that is for the HAD to improve the website. So any idea when this will be done? And when will we see the result? Director, we've started the improvement. What we want to review is that apart from what's new, we'd like to provide another column, that is the SE Friends of SE Award Scheme, so as to provide more information for the public. And when resources allow, we would like to improve the attractiveness of the web page, and we have started the work in this regard. Any target say when will it be completed in a number of months, or will it be updated continuously, and therefore there will not be any target. We would like to update it or improve it as soon as possible, and we have kick-started the work, and after completion it will be updated continuously. Any information? Maybe I'll defer to my colleague and he will give you a timetable. We will, as Director said, try to complete it as soon as possible. We should be able to complete it within 6 months. Yes, 6 months, right? Because we will, in our report, we'll follow up on it. And also, Chairman, there was a matching forum for the business sector and SEs to form partnerships. So, Director, on this point, any new ideas to improve the effectiveness of this matching forum so that entrepreneurs, businessmen who would like to help SEs could invest in them? Any new ideas? Are you talking about 4.34, 4.35, etc., 4.38 matching forum? On matching forum, through extensive publicity efforts, many business organizations are now more interested in joining the matching forum. So through extensive publicity, we would like to achieve this goal, and we have started to work in this regard. Apart from the matching forum, we also have a mentorship program or mentorship scheme, and the latest initiative is that for awardees under the Friends of the SE scheme, with their consent, we will recruit them as mentors so as to provide a wider network of information so that they can provide counseling to people who are interested to set up SEs. Ellen, I'll see if I have missed out anything. Or perhaps I can ask Kenneth for his help. We're talking about issue 5. Also on publicity, Chairman, on the chapter concerning publicity, I'd like to ask about the Friends of SE. SE is a business, and those running SEs may not have the expertise in running a business. Now, on page 58 and page 59 of the report, the Friends of the mentorship scheme didn't have wasn't quite effective because of the limited number of mentors and the short period of time involved. Now, the in 4.11, well, the audit has recommended a review on the mentorship scheme. So any direction how the mentorship scheme will be improved, how many professionals, say lawyers, accountants, bankers, are there under the mentorship scheme? Because I think many professionals are committed to helping the SEs. They also have the time, but there is no way for them to make a start. Have you taken the initiative to contact the professionals, say the HCAP, the recruit professional mentors to help SEs? Director, at present, for those interested in joining the mentorship scheme as mentors, many of them come from the professional sectors, from the logistics sector, accounting, and management, and we have more mentors coming from these professional sectors. What we want is to attract mentors other than those from professional bodies. For example, many SEs would like to operate a catering business, and we would like to therefore recruit mentors from the catering sector. But how? Say for certain trades, first of all, how do you recruit mentors in these trades? Let's say if I am an experienced entrepreneur in the catering business, I don't see what publicity you have made to attract me to become a mentor, to help SEs. So what have you done, or what will you do to help? How about giving us a written report? I can give you more details in writing. We take a systematic approach. As far as professional bodies are concerned, we approach them and introduce this mentorship scheme to them. As for the catering industry, etc., we publicize the mentorship scheme through the relevant chambers of commerce or trade associations. The scheme and the details are uploaded on our website, and any interested party can contact us. Chairman, may I be allowed one more question? Now, overseeing an SE for 9 months, I don't see much result. Would you consider extending the duration of the scheme? 9 months is too short. Is too short for any advice to improve the operation of the SE. So you need to extend the duration. Just my suggestion. Yes, we can definitely consider it. Now, there is a mentorship scheme under ESR program. What about the 3E project? No, not under the 3E project. Why not? We look at the projects proposed. There is no such recommendation. I don't see why she says there is no such need. Perhaps you can make an offer and see if any applicants feel there is a need. Even for business organizations, very often we engage consultants to prepare consultant reports. Even when we run a business organization, we may not be aware of the practice outside, and we may not see the shortcomings of our own organizations. So even if according to the survey, the SEs opine that it's not necessary to have mentors, you may consider offering them one. Chairman, I wasn't saying that there is no need. We looked at the applications received, and no mentorship scheme was proposed. But in the future, we welcome these applications. Well, so please learn from Director Mrs. Tan. Any other questions? If not, if there are other questions, you can submit them in writing. If necessary, we can have another meeting. We will proceed to a closed door meeting first. If necessary, you will be notified. May I make this comment? In 2008, the subcommittee on poverty alleviation conducted a study, and in the audit report, it sets out in gist a list of problems identified by the relevant subcommittee of LegCo, and I was also responsible for compiling this report. This report was made by the subcommittee to study the subject of combating poverty. So, just to urge the Secretary, please give us the report within this year. Don't drag your feet because we have expectations on social enterprises. This issue has been followed up by the LegCo for many years. We hope that very soon the issues could be addressed. Now, in 2006, 2007, 2011, the Council had held motion debates on social enterprises. So please spend more time to address our concerns. If necessary, we will write to you. So thank you, Secretary, and your team.